The snow fell thick over Berlin that winter, muting the city into a grey hush, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Somewhere behind stone walls and iron gates, men in polished boots and heavy coats leaned over maps, tracing borders with gloved fingers. They spoke in absolutes, of destiny, of inevitability, of enemies who would fold when pressed hard enough. They spoke with certainty, and certainty, it turned out, was the most dangerous weapon of all. Across the Atlantic, America was still pretending the storm wouldn't reach its shores. In December of 1941, Private First Class Daniel Mercer stood on the deck of a transport ship, slicing through the Atlantic, the cold biting through his wool coat and into his bones. He was 22. Farm-raised from eastern Iowa, and the ocean stretched around him like something ancient and unforgiving. He held the rail with stiff fingers, staring into the rolling black water as if it might offer answers. "Hell of a thing," Sergeant Tom Alvarez muttered beside him, pulling his collar tighter. "World's gone mad and we're the ones sent to fix it." Daniel didn't answer. He was thinking about home, about the smell of his mother's bread, about his father hunched over the radio the night the news came through Pearl Harbor, about how the world had tilted on its axis in a single broadcast. He remembered the silence afterward. Not shock, not panic, just silence, heavy and final. Now that silence was gone, replaced by the steady thrum of engines and the low murmur of men who pretended they weren't afraid, none of them were supposed to be here. Not yet. Not like this. High above Europe, a war had already been burning for years. Hitler had gambled everything on speed, on intimidation, on the belief that the old powers were weak and the new ones unprepared. He misread the world, not just its armies but its people. He believed America was soft, divided, unwilling to bleed for lands it could barely find on a map. Daniel Mercer was about to prove him wrong. The ship groaned as it cut through another wave. Somewhere below deck, men played cards under dim lights, laughing too loudly. Others wrote letters they weren't sure they'd ever mail. The officers stayed mostly quiet, eyes sharp, voices clipped. Everyone knew this was only the beginning. Africa first, they'd been told. Then Italy. Then, God help them, all the way to France. "Danny," Alvarez said, softer now, "you ever been out of the States before?" Daniel shook his head. "Never been farther than Chicago." Alvarez snorted. "Well, kid, Europe's one hell of a first trip." The wind howled, carrying with it the weight of something larger than any of them, a clash of empires driven by arrogance and ambition, by one man's belief that the world would kneel if he pushed hard enough. Weeks later, North Africa burned. The sun there was merciless, bleaching the land into dust and stone. Daniel's boots sank into sand-stained dark with oil and blood. German artillery cracked the horizon, sharp and precise. These weren't the disorganized cowards they'd been warned about. These were professionals, men who had conquered half continent already and expected to conquer the rest. "Incoming!" someone screamed. The ground erupted. Daniel hit the dirt, heart hammering, the taste of grit filling his mouth. He pressed his helmet down with one hand and clutched his rifle with the other, knuckles white. This was no border skirmish. This was global war, born from miscalculation, fed by pride. Lieutenant Harris crawled past, shouting over the noise. "Hold your line. They think we'll break. Prove 'em wrong." Daniel fired blind at first, then steadied himself. He saw German troops advancing, disciplined, methodical, not monsters, men. That realization hit harder than the explosions. Somewhere, they too had homes. Families, radios crackling with speeches about destiny. A medic dragged a wounded corporal past him, blood soaking through a torn sleeve. "Don't let me die out here," the man whispered. "You won't," the medic said, though his eyes betrayed the lie. That night, after the guns went quiet, Daniel sat against a half-track, hands shaking too badly to light a cigarette. Alvarez passed him one anyway, struck the match himself. "They thought we wouldn't come," Alvarez said, staring into the dark. "Thought we'd stay home and count our money." Daniel exhaled smoke, watching it vanish. "They were wrong." "Yeah," Alvarez replied, "but being wrong doesn't stop the bullets." Far away, in rooms lined with flags and portraits, strategies were redrawn. New fronts opened. Hitler pushed east, then south, then dared the world to stop him. He believed numbers and fear would carry the day. He believed America would hesitate, that its soldiers would crack under real pressure. Instead, men like Daniel crossed oceans they'd never seen, fought in deserts they couldn't pronounce, and learned, fast, that war was not about speeches or maps. It was about moments, seconds, choices made under fire. Back home, Daniel's mother kept the radio on all day, volume low, as if loudness might invite bad news. His father read the casualty lists in silence. In factories across the country, women welded steel and riveted wings, working double shifts under banners that promised victory. The world was mobilizing. The pieces were in motion. And the cost, human, unbearable, was only beginning to reveal itself. Daniel lay awake that night, staring at the stars over Africa, wondering how a single man's misreading of power had dragged millions into the same nightmare. He wondered how far this road would go, how much it would take before someone finally said enough. In the distance, engines rumbled again. Orders were coming. Another push, another test. Daniel closed his eyes, gripping his rifle, knowing with a certainty that chilled him deeper than any winter wind. This war was nowhere near its worst. By the time spring rolled across North Africa, the war had learned their names. Not written down anywhere official, not yet, but spoken in foxholes, muttered in prayers, carved into the backs of dog tags with the tips of knives. The men of Daniel Mercer's unit had survived their first baptism of fire, and survival had changed them. It stripped something away and replaced it with something harder, sharper, less forgiving. The desert no longer looked empty. It looked watched. German counterattacks came at dawn, precise as a clock. Artillery first, always artillery. Then armor, crawling forward like steel insects, their treads grinding the land into submission. The enemy knew how to fight. That truth gnawed at Daniel more than fear ever could. These weren't reckless zealots. They were disciplined soldiers, following orders born from a vision that refused to admit limits. "Command says hold," Lieutenant Harris shouted over the whine of incoming shells. "We give ground now. We'll be chasing it all the way back to the sea." Alvarez crouched beside Daniel, loading a fresh clip. "They ever tell command it's easy to say that from a map?" Daniel managed a tight smile. "Maps don't bleed." The attack hit hard. Machine gun fire stitched the sand, forcing them low. A tank shell tore through a nearby ridge, sending a geyser of dirt and smoke skyward. Men screamed, some in pain, some in pure animal terror. Daniel fired until his rifle burned his hands, every shot a prayer that felt less like hope and more like obligation. At some point, the line held. No one could say exactly when. 1 minute, they were drowning in noise and smoke. The next, there was only ringing silence and the smell of cordite. They counted heads afterward. The count was smaller than it had been that morning. That night, the desert cooled fast. Daniel sat with his back against a crate, helmet off, sweat drying into grit on his skin. A replacement, barely 19, stared at the ground, eyes wide and hollow. "I thought," the kid said quietly, "I thought they'd run when they saw us." Alvarez took a long drink from his canteen before answering. "Yeah, a lot of folks thought that." The truth was setting in across every front. Hitler had misjudged not just America's will to fight, but the sheer scale of what he'd awakened. And now, the response was coming. Not fast, not clean, but relentless. By summer, Daniel's unit shipped north, trading sand for stone. Sicily rose from the sea like a challenge carved in rock. The landings were chaos. Boats bucking in rough water, men vomiting from fear and diesel fumes, bullets snapping the air before their boots even hit shore. "Move! Move!" officers shouted, voices cracking. Daniel ran, lungs burning, the beach exploding around him. He tripped over a body, couldn't tell whose, and kept going because stopping meant dying. Somewhere behind him, a machine gun opened up, cutting down a cluster of men before anyone could return fire. They took the beach. They always took the beach. But the cost climbed with every mile inland. Villages were empty or shattered. Civilians watched from behind broken shutters, faces tight with fear and something else. Resentment, maybe, or exhaustion. War had visited them long before the Americans arrived. In a stone farmhouse outside Messina, Daniel found himself sharing a cigarette with a British corporal, both men too tired to speak much. "Funny thing?" the Brit said, eventually. "Back home, they thought this would be over by Christmas. That was 3 Christmases ago." Daniel nodded. "Back home, they're still saying the worst is behind us." The corporal laughed softly, without humor. "That's what they said before France fell. Italy dragged on. Mountains, mud, cold rain soaking through everything. The Germans fought retreating battles with ruthless efficiency, blowing bridges, mining roads, turning every ridge into a killing field. The Americans pushed forward anyway, because that's what they'd come to do. Letters from home grew heavier. Daniel's mother wrote about ration lines, about neighbors losing sons. His father's handwriting grew shakier. "We're proud of you," the letters said. "Just come home." But home felt farther away with every step north. Then came the news. Plans for something bigger, something that would decide everything. France. The briefings were careful, almost reverent. Maps unfurled across tables, red and blue arrows slicing into Normandy. The officers spoke of timing, of tides, of air support. They did not speak of fear, but it was there, in the way hands clenched, in the way no one cracked jokes this time. Alvarez leaned over to Daniel as the briefing ended. "This is it, isn't it?" Daniel swallowed. "Feels like it." The night before embarkation, Daniel stood on deck again. Another transport, another cold wind. The sea was rougher now, darker. He thought of the first crossing, how green he'd been, how certain, in some naive corner of his mind, that courage alone would be enough. Below deck, a chaplain moved quietly among the men, offering words that didn't always find ears willing to hear them. Some men prayed. Others stared at nothing. Daniel checked his gear for the 10th time. Rifle, ammo, helmet, letters folded into his breast pocket. Alvarez sat beside him, unusually quiet. "You ever think about why we're really here?" Alvarez asked finally. Daniel considered the question. "Because someone thought the world wouldn't fight back." Alvarez nodded slowly. "Guess they're learning different." The engines roared to life. Orders were shouted. Somewhere ahead lay beaches with code names and hedgerows thick with death. Somewhere ahead lay a turning point born from arrogance and answered with blood. As the convoy pushed into the dark, Daniel felt the weight of history pressing down on his chest. Not the grand kind written in books, but the kind carried by men who would step into gunfire because they believed, somehow, that stopping one mad gamble was worth everything it might cost them. The horizon swallowed the ships one by one, and the war rose to meet them. Dawn came to Normandy like a wound opening. The sea heaved under a sky the color of steel, choked with clouds and aircraft. Daniel Mercer stood packed shoulder to shoulder in the landing craft, the stench of fuel and sweat thick enough to taste. No one spoke now. The jokes, the bravado, the quiet prayers, they'd all been spent somewhere out on the water. The ramp rattled with each wave. 30 seconds, the coxswain shouted. Daniel tightened his grip on his rifle. His heart wasn't pounding anymore. It felt distant, muffled, like it belonged to someone else. He thought of his mother's last letter, folded thin from rereading. He thought of Iowa fields under summer sun. He thought of nothing at all. The ramp slammed down. All hell broke loose. Machine gun fire tore into the surf, ripping men apart before they Normandy. The water turned red almost instantly. Daniel ran because everyone ran, boots dragging him under, rifle held high as bullets snapped past his ears. "Get off the beach," someone screamed. A man beside him spun and vanished in a spray of blood. Another tripped and didn't get back up. Daniel stumbled behind a steel obstacle, chest heaving, lungs burning, fear finally catching up to him in a crushing wave. This was the miscalculation made flesh. Hitler had believed fortresses and fear would stop them. He had believed no army would willingly charge into this. He had been wrong, but wrong didn't mean powerless. The defenses were brutal, layered, designed to break men before they reached the sand. Alvarez crawled up beside Daniel, face streaked with blood that wasn't all his. "You still breathing, farm boy?" Daniel nodded, unable to speak. "Good," Alvarez said. "Then let's move." They ran in bursts, diving into shell holes, pressing against the earth as mortars thundered overhead. Officers shouted commands that dissolved into noise. Units tangled and broke apart. Medics worked frantically, hands slick, eyes wild. Somehow, through sheer stubbornness, through bodies piled where walls should have been, the Americans pushed off the beach. By noon, the sand was behind them, but the fight only deepened. The hedgerows inland were a nightmare, thick, ancient earthen walls topped with dense brush. Each one a natural bunker. The Germans waited until men were right on top of them before opening fire. Every field was a trap. Every advance cost blood. Daniel's squad moved cautiously, breath held, boots sinking into damp soil. The air smelled green and sharp, grass and smoke and death tangled together. A burst of fire erupted from the hedgerow ahead. 2 men went down instantly. "Grenade!" Alvarez shouted. Daniel pulled the pin and hurled it with everything he had. The explosion shook the earth, sending leaves raining down. They charged, screaming, fear and fury blurring together. The Germans fell back, but not far. There was always another line, another gun. Days blurred. Sleep came in snatches. Food tasted like cardboard. The sound of artillery became constant, a background hum to existence itself. Then came the counterattack. It hit at dusk, tanks grinding forward through the hedgerows, infantry moving with them like shadows. The ground shook. Flares turned night into harsh, flickering day. "Hold your positions!" Lieutenant Harris yelled, voice raw. Daniel fired until his rifle clicked empty, reloading with shaking hands. A tank loomed ahead, massive and unstoppable, its cannon swinging toward their position. "Bazooka!" someone shouted. Alvarez grabbed the launcher, sprinting forward without hesitation. "Tom!" Daniel yelled. Alvarez didn't look back. The shot hit true, the rocket slamming into the tank's side in a deafening explosion. Flames burst out. The tank ground to a halt, and then a second shell tore through the hedgerow. Daniel was thrown backward, the world flashing white. When he staggered to his feet, ears ringing, he saw Alvarez lying motionless, half buried in dirt and smoke. He ran, dropped to his knees, hands shaking as he rolled Alvarez over. There was no mistaking it. For a moment, the battle receded. The noise dulled. Daniel stared at the man who taught him how to load his rifle faster, how to laugh in the dark, how to survive. Rage burned through him, hot and merciless. The Germans pushed again. Daniel rose, eyes hard, grief transmuted into something cold and focused. He fired, moved, shouted orders he had no rank to give. Around him, others did the same. The line bent, but it didn't break. By morning, the field was theirs. Victory felt nothing like they'd imagined. It was quiet, hollow, stained. They buried Alvarez at the edge of the hedgerow, helmet marking the spot. No speeches, just hands pressed briefly to steel, eyes cast down. Weeks later, Paris fell, not in flames, but in celebration. Crowds surged through streets, cheering soldiers who barely recognized themselves anymore. Daniel walked past smiling faces and waving flags, feeling like a ghost among the living. Hitler's gamble was unraveling. The fronts closed in. The world he thought he could dominate was pushing back from every direction. But the cost, God, the cost, was written in the eyes of every man who marched east. As winter crept in again, Daniel stood on a ridge overlooking a ruined town, snow beginning to fall. Somewhere ahead lay Germany. Somewhere ahead lay an end that felt both close and impossibly far. He clutched Alvarez's dog tags in his hand, the metal cold against his palm, and wondered how many more miscalculations would be paid for in lives before this was over. The guns rumbled again in the distance, and Daniel stepped forward into whatever came next. Germany in the spring of 1945 looked like the aftermath of a long, unanswered scream. Cities lay cracked open, streets choked with rubble and twisted steel. Smoke drifted constantly, as if the land itself was still burning from the inside. Daniel Mercer moved through it all with the dull focus of a man who had learned how not to feel too much at once. His uniform hung looser now. His face was older than it had any right to be. They crossed the Rhine under cover of darkness, engineers throwing bridges across the river while artillery thundered overhead. The Germans still fought, some fiercely, some desperately, but the momentum was gone. You could feel it in the way prisoners surrendered with hollow eyes, in the way gunfire sputtered instead of roared. This was what happened when a vision built on domination finally collapsed under its own weight. In a small town outside Frankfurt, Daniel's unit cleared a factory that had once made machine parts. Inside, they found civilians huddled together, women, children, old men, too frightened to speak at first. A girl stared at Daniel from behind her mother's coat, eyes wide and dark. He lowered his rifle slowly. "It's okay," he said, voice gentle despite the foreign words. "It's over. We're not here to hurt you." The words felt strange in his mouth. Over. The idea barely made sense. Later that day, they found the camp. No briefing had prepared them for it. No photograph, no rumor. The gates stood open. The sign above them, a lie carved in iron. Inside, skeletons in striped cloth stared back with eyes that had seen too much. The smell hit first. Sweet, rotten, impossible to forget. Men who had faced machine guns without flinching now turned away, retching, swearing, praying. Daniel stood frozen, rage and grief tangling until he could barely breathe. This was where the misreading of power had led. Not just armies clashing, but humanity reduced to ash by ideology and indifference. A survivor reached out and grasped Daniel's sleeve with trembling fingers. "You came," the man whispered in broken English. "You came." Daniel swallowed hard. He nodded because words failed him. From that moment on, the war stopped being abstract. It wasn't about borders or strategies or speeches anymore. It was about stopping this, about making sure no one ever believed again that the world would look away. The final push was relentless. Town by town, street by street. Sometimes the fighting was fierce. Sometimes the Germans simply laid down their arms, exhausted, defeated. Rumors spread faster than orders. Hitler was in Berlin. Hitler was dead. Hitler would never surrender. Then, one grey morning, the guns went quiet. The announcement came through in fragments, shouted from jeeps, crackling over radios, passed mouth to mouth until it finally sank in. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. No one cheered at first. Daniel sat on the curb outside a shattered building, helmet resting on his knees. Around him, men stared into space, laughed softly, cried without shame. Someone opened a bottle that had been saved too long. Someone else just closed his eyes and slept. Daniel thought of Alvarez, of the beach at Normandy, of the desert sun in Africa, of all the names carved into memory instead of stone. Victory felt like relief, soaked in sorrow. Weeks later, Daniel stood on the deck of a ship once more, this time headed home. The ocean was calmer than he remembered. Or maybe he was different now, less likely to be fooled by appearances. He watched the horizon, thinking about what waited on the other side. Parades, maybe. Questions he didn't know how to answer. A life that had to be rebuilt from pieces. When the Statue of Liberty finally came into view, some men laughed, some saluted. Daniel just stood there, heart tight, eyes stinging. Home hadn't changed. He had. In Iowa, his parents waited at the station, older, thinner, faces breaking into smiles that carried years of worry inside them. His mother held him like she'd never let go. His father gripped his shoulder, saying nothing, because nothing was enough. At night, Daniel dreamed of engines and gunfire, of hedgerows and snow. He woke sweating, breathing hard, then lay there listening to the quiet, real quiet, the kind that didn't hide explosions behind it. Slowly, he learned how to live again. Years later, Daniel stood at a memorial, reading names etched in stone. He traced Alvarez's with his finger, the metal of the dog tags warm in his pocket. The world had survived one man's catastrophic misreading of power, but only because millions refused to surrender their humanity to it. The cost had been unbearable. The lesson, written in blood. Daniel looked up at the sky, blue and open and peaceful, in a way that once would have felt impossible. He breathed in, then out, and for the first time in a long while, the war loosened its grip, just enough to let him believe that remembering was part of honoring, and that surviving was not a betrayal, but a responsibility, because the world had learned, at terrible cost, what happens when arrogance goes unanswered, and because men like Daniel Mercer had answered it anyway.